Okay, so we have Sophie's idle animation working. Let's go back to Mixamo and grab a run animation. Um, or you could choose walk if you wanted. Let's search run. Looks like running might have been a better search term. Jogging. Let's see what that looks like. Not bad. Running. Running's fast. Oh, here's an example of what one of the things I wanted to show you. So you see in here how the character's like actually moving forward. We can choose down here in place, and that might make it a little easier to preview. But more importantly, the difference here is like way back in the very first video, I think I mentioned you can have animations that actually move the character, so you're not even really writing code to move the character yourself. You're letting the animation handle that, and that's called root motion. Our project isn't using root motion, so we want to make sure we're using the in place option here. So basically our character animation is just going to be running in place, and our code will move the character, as opposed to having the animation itself actually move the character. So that's kind of a key difference, like whether you're going to use root motion or not. We are not using root motion, so we want to make sure we use in place here. And I think the rest of the settings are fine, so I'm going to go ahead and download this thing. It looks like it saved my settings that I was using, so I'll just choose download. And then when it's done, I'm going to add it to my project in the animations Sophie folder that I made. I think it's done. Oops. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. If you choose the skin, I think you can actually open these things in Windows 10 by default, which is kind of crazy. But anyway, here's my running animation. So let's drag it in there. I'm going to expand it, and there actually is a clip called running. It looks like the editor has remembered the model that I wanted to use to preview this. But if yours doesn't have one, again, you can drag whatever model you want into that preview area, and you can hit play and see what it looks like. Now, I mentioned the root motion thing. If you, and also you can like make this resized how you like, but anyway, if you were to have root motion working, you would notice this little circular base with the compass arrow thing would actually be moving based on how that animation is going to move the character when it plays. So you can see here that our animation is in place. It's not moving the character at all. And that's what we want for this game, because our code will move the character. And so we'll go back to our animation, our animator. I'm going to put it back up here so that I can see my project window and the animation controller at the same time. And I'm going to drag running into the animation controller, the Sophie animation controller. And so now I have this running state. Actually, there's one step I seem to have forgotten. If I select my running animation again, you can see loop time is not checked. It's not going to let me edit it here. I have to go click on this containing FBX file thing here. And then I'm going to make sure I'm on the animation tab, and I need to loop it. And I'll go down and choose apply. Okay, so now I know that my running animation is properly going to loop, and I need a way to transition from idle to running. So I will right click on idle and choose make transition and select running so that we transition from idle to running. And then I'm going to do the same thing, right click on running and make a transition from running back to idle. And that way, when we stop running, we can go back to idle. And so this is as complex as our states need to get right now for this animation controller. But we don't want this to like Right now, the way this works, the transition is going to happen automatically as soon as the idle animation is done. So if I were to play the game, you will see this little progress bar start filling up if I go back to that. And when it gets to the end, it will transition over to running, and then running will play one time, and when it gets to the end, it'll transition back to idle. That is not what we want. Instead, we want some kind of condition to govern this transition, and the condition should be based on whether the player's trying to move or not. So we need to make an animation parameter. And I think what will make sense, so, if we make a new, in the animator here, you can choose parameters and then this plus button. And we have to pick one of these types. So it's like what kind of data is going to be useful for us to understand when to transition from idle to running and back. I think it's going to be a float, because what we can do is look at the value of our input, and if the player is pressing a button to move, which will be essentially it's a vector 2, we can decide that we're trying to move. And if the player's not pressing any input, that value would be 0, and we will understand that the player's not trying to move, and that's when we'd be in idle. So I'm going to call this like movement input, and in my transition here, so you select that little arrow from idle to running, I'm going to add a condition over here, and I'm going to give it like a very small number. So like if movement input is greater than 0.01, so there is some input, we're going to go into running from idle. And then likewise, when we're in the running state, when do we go back to idle? Well, we want to do that when the movement input is less than, we'll say again, 0.01. And that'll just give us a little wiggle room, I guess. So eventually what we could do, if we wanted, is have, like if you're using an analog controller, you would get a value for movement input that's somewhere between 0 and 1, right? Like 0 would mean you're not moving at all, and 1 would mean you are moving the controller as far as it goes, the joystick or the analog stick all the way to the edge, so it's pushed as far as it goes. And if you're pushed as far as it goes, you would have like your run animation. But if you're like barely pushing it, what you could do is have some intermediary state that's either a walk or even like maybe a crawl or a tiptoe or something like that. And what's neat is that Unity will actually blend between your idle and your tiptoe, and then between your tiptoe and your running. So you kind of get this really seamless transition, which you'll see from idle to running here too. But I guess the takeaway is we could add more intermediary states here if we wanted. All right, so this is sort of set up right, but you're gonna, well, first of all, if we run the game, nothing is ever gonna change movement input right now. We could if I drag this window down here so you can see the scene preview at the same time, I could type in something for movement input. As long as it's greater than 0.01 or whatever, it'll make this transition. And you might have already noticed the problem. So if I go back to 0, see, that looked pretty good. But if I put it here to 1, notice it's not going to transition until it hits the end of the animation. If I put it at 0, it'll hit the end of the animation and it'll loop. So what we need it set up so that it's going to instantly transition and not wait for it to hit the end of the currently playing idle animation before it moves. So what we can do to achieve that is again select this transition, and we're going to uncheck has exit time, basically. I think that's all it's going to take, really. So let's run the game again and test that. And I'll hit 1. Yeah, and see, now she instantly started running. And if I go back to 0, back to idle. If I put 1, she's running. So now the last step is to control this code, or control this animation parameter in code. And that is what I will do in the next video. But actually, let me make sure I've unchecked has exit time here too, because we don't want to have to loop or play run to its conclusion before we hit that transition. So I want to make sure exit time is turned off for both my transitions. I'm going to save my scene. I'm going to save my project. And I will make another commit here, and we will say added run animation. And well, you know what? That's good enough, I think. All right, so I added the run animation. All right, I'm going to push this, and I'll see you in the next video.